to our moderator, Andy Buzinski, who is a associate professor of law, and he directs the Elliott Milstein Civil Advocacy Clinic at American University Law School, as well as being a board member. And with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Christina, and thanks everyone for being here. So it is my pleasure to welcome our two panelists for today's discussion, Mobilizing After the Election. We have joining us Emily Martin, who is the Chief Program Officer at the National Women's Law Center, as well as Laurie Ball-Cooper, who is Vice President, U.S. Legal Programs at the International Refugee Assistance Project, or IRAP. So before we dive in to engaging our panelists on this topic, I did want to start the conversation by framing it. I don't know how many of you know, but there's an election in 2 weeks. And we are not in this conversation particularly weighing in on that election in terms of the candidates or the parties that they are running on. Rather, our goal in this conversation is through a nonpartisan lens to discuss how public interest lawyering is impacted by elections, by the outcome of elections, and by this election, no matter what that outcome might be. So, Washington Council of Lawyers generally seeks to create space for public interest-minded lawyers to convene and talk about our shared mission. So this conversation, we hope, will be a chance to engage with two leaders in public interest about how they anticipate elections, how changes in presidential administrations impact the work that they're doing, and how we, as public interest lawyers, can mobilize to meet the moment after the election, whatever that moment might look like. So with that, I thought we could start, Laurie and Emily, by each of you giving us just a brief overview of your work and particularly how government policy decisions sort of tie into it. Emily, maybe we could start with you.
Sure, and thank you for having me in this conversation. So, as you heard, I work at the National Women's Law Center. We are a gender justice law and policy and culture change organization, and we work across multiple issues, and we like to say that we use the law in all its forms. So some of the things that mean is we engage with Congress, we lobby. We do a lot of work with federal agencies, depending on whether it's a friendly or a hostile administration. It sort of shifts what that work looks like, but a lot of engagement in the regulatory process, a lot of, especially with the friendlier administration, efforts to inform enforcement priorities, as well as sort of just communications work to sort of lift up policies and their impacts and what they mean. We also do a fair amount of work in state legislatures, both defending against bad policies and pushing good ones from our perspective, and try to use the state work to speak to the federal work and vice versa, to lift up models of success from the states that can be replicated at the federal level, to use our state work to engage key grassroots leaders and on-the-ground partners that can be really important in talking to a particular member of Congress or otherwise making the case for a policy. And in terms of the substance, our work includes a big focus on reproductive rights and health, work around childcare and income security, work around rights of women and girls and gender expansive people in the workplace and in schools, as well as work around judicial nominations and the like. So a rich tapestry of issues for sure.
Thank you so much. And Laurie, if you could share.
Sure. So at the International Refugee Assistance Project, we provide legal services, impact litigation, and advocacy work, which includes both policy work and sort of communications and narrative change work, similar to what Emily was referencing in terms of culture change. And we do that work on behalf of forcibly displaced people. So we use the term refugee in our name, sort of broadly speaking, not strictly speaking in terms of the International Convention and the legal definition of a refugee, but to really think about serving people who are experiencing or at risk of forced displacement. And for our US legal programs, which includes both direct legal services to individual clients and families, as well as our impact litigation team and all of our pro bono work with US-based firms, we really focus primarily on people currently outside the United States and trying to access safety within the United States. So that's one thing that's very different about IRAP's work compared to many other groups. And we really interact with government policies, as you might imagine, in like every possible way. And so, of course, we have the government policies that very directly affect immigration. Those are federal laws, especially as they speak to people outside the United States trying to access within. Certainly, there are local laws that also can have dramatic effects on folks once they're already here. But then we also, of course, are directly affected by migration crises that are caused by policies not only of the US government, but by other governments across the world at sort of any given moment. And then especially within the Western Hemisphere, our work is also really affected by US foreign policy in the sense of sort of so-called migration deterrence policies. So we find ourselves interacting with federal law and laws of other countries in sort of 1,000 ways on any given day.
Great, thank you both so much. So sort of in each of your contexts, I'm wondering if you could share a little bit, maybe Laurie, I can come back to you, on how your work is impacted by changes in administrations at a general level.
Sure, I think one of the biggest effects on our work in terms of changes of administrations writ large is the anxiety and uncertainty that comes with it. And we talk a lot with good reason about the role of misinformation and disinformation in the US election process itself. But there are, of course, parallel processes of misinformation and disinformation affecting people on the move all over the world. And that interacts with things people are saying and then consequently hearing about what's going on in the United States. So there's a whole level of anxiety, some of it based in announced changes, some of it based in misinformation, and some of it based in active disinformation efforts. And so a lot of the sort of larger scope changes are felt at that level. Clients who heard X on TikTok, and it's coming back to affect coming back to affect the questions that they're bringing to us and the level of trust that they have in legal advice that they're receiving, not only from us, but from other providers as well. And then, of course, there's the actual change that comes with a change in administration and the changes to policies that often come in short order. And we've seen that over and over again, right? Some of the first actions that the Biden administration took were related to immigration in the immediate post-inauguration phase. Of course, some of the first actions that Trump took in his presidency were about migration and in the immediate post-inauguration phase. And so we see sometimes rapid and dramatic changes. And so we have sort of all of our current clients of not only IRAP, but all immigration legal service providers wondering, does this affect me, right? So the questions aren't coming, even if it's a narrow group of clients affected, which it is not always. But even if it is a narrow group of clients affected, nobody knows that. Nobody can digest this and understand it on the front end. So actually every client is calling and asking whether or not they're affected, and if so, how. So there's a real challenge of getting information out there. Also, IRAP, like many of our peer organizations, cares not only about our direct clients, but also our client communities. So we have a large legal information presence, and we're trying to get information into the hands of the people that we cannot provide direct services to. And so updating all of that and translating all of that and telling people that it's updated and getting it out into the world is a whole other set of the immediate project that comes with not only a change in administration, but then in the change of laws that come throughout any administration. We've seen that kind of change throughout the Biden administration. We saw it at a much more sort of rapid fire pace in the Trump administration, but there have been dramatic and really, really harmful changes for our clients in the Biden administration as well. So that kind of double layer of responsiveness around direct clients communication and then legal information. And then there's the strategic response on the litigation side as well, in terms of bringing lawsuits to challenge the new rules articulated or advanced by new administrations as well.
I guess I would say that while this is a nonpartisan conversation, it's certainly true that especially as polarization on a range of issues has increased, it's a pretty clear distinction on most of the issues we work on when the administration shifts as to whether It is mostly a friendly and aligned audience, which doesn't mean you don't have disagreements and you don't have to advocate and there isn't work to do. But the difference between doing that with folks who, in some sense, share your goals and are willing to listen, even if there are other reasons why it is hard to make progress, versus an administration that is just sort of fundamentally hostile to many of the core principles and policies that we are dedicated to. And so that shows up in many different ways. Obviously, the substance of the work looks different. In a hostile administration, not only is, of course, our stance much more likely to be defensive, there is a real shift in having less predictability about what's coming when, and less ability to plan and prep. And we'll talk a little bit about the scenario planning we've been doing to try to go into whatever scenario we find ourselves in as ready as possible. But one of the real challenges in administration that is more hostile to gender justice generally, to reproductive rights specifically, but to many other things as well, is the unpredictability of where the attacks are going to come from and how they are going to show up. And so that this makes a difference, among other things, on the day-to-day nature of the work and the ability to plan and prioritize. In an administration that is more ideologically aligned, there are many more opportunities to collaborate in thinking about sort of what is possible and to push, often with partners, to push our friends, to give them the cover and enable them to do the good thing, and sometimes to hold them accountable when they don't do the good thing. But it is just a very different stance and a very different set of strategic questions that we bring to the work, depending on who it is that we are talking to.
So I guess picking up on what you just mentioned towards the end of your answer, Emily, you know, you've both alluded to, after the last two elections, a fairly seismic shift in administration policy, you know, resulting from the outcome of those elections. And, you know, if elections going forward, this one included, continue to, you know, present the chance that there is a seismic shift in administration policy, or how the government is responding to the issues that you're working on, how do you think about preparing for the changes that come from that election outcome? And Emily, maybe I can come back to you, and Laurie, then turn to your thoughts.
So start with an anecdote, which is the Chronicle of Philanthropy, which is sort of a publication aimed at foundations and other donors, recently reached out to have a conversation about the scenario planning that we were doing. And my team said, oh, this is so exciting to get it out there in front of donors and brand awareness. And so I talked to the reporter. We had a great conversation, and turns out the National Women's Law Center is in the first paragraph of the article, which is really exciting. And the first sentence is, the National Women's Law Center was not prepared in 2016 for the election of Donald Trump, which is right. It is true. And that is a story I told, because it really was true that going into 2016, and we were definitely not alone in the universe of progressive organizations that we were in partnership with, both didn't believe or refused to believe this was really going to happen. And we found ourselves in a bit of a situation. So this time around, we are really spending some time naming where do we think the threats will come, and not just that, because the threats will be numerous if that is the world in which we find ourselves, but trying to identify at the front end, where are the places where our organization in particular needs to play a leadership role, where we have the particular value add, the particular expertise, the particular stance within the community. Because naming those to ourselves in advance, as well as doing whatever work we can do to, you know, research and be ready and to sort of have our arguments and our strategies at hand, but naming for ourselves, here are the places where we are the front lines, is really helpful in a context where again, there's just a constant crisis, and you know, the drinking from the fire hose is a real challenge. So that is one thing that we have been doing internally, is sort of naming where do we bring leadership that would meet this moment, and so where are the places where we would be most invested, while, signing on to all the things, being in solidarity and support in a wide variety of coalitions, but sort of trying to get ahead of where do we think the challenges are that we are really uniquely positioned to lead. And thinking about a possible friendly administration, obviously it's sort of a psychologically more pleasant task, but still challenging to figure out, to have an agenda that that is meaningful, that could be moved even in the event of a divided Congress without a lot of lawmaking, even in the context of the Supreme Court's real assault on regulatory authority and regulatory policymaking by the executive. And so that is also work that we are doing at this point, is trying to identify where are the places where change is possible, where impact is possible. And again, where is the Law Center really positioned to drive that change? So those are sort of the big questions that we're asking ourselves as we are strategizing.
And I don't know that I have a ton to add to that. We're going through really the same, and we've all been going through, I think, for many months, kind of the same processes of scenario planning, and trying to make sure that we are prepared for whatever comes in January. I think one thing that's also been really special, frankly, this time around too, has been that the preparation has also been in community. So I think most of us are doing the kind of internal scenario planning that Emily talked about, and thinking about exactly the things that Emily mentioned. Where do we have the most value add? Where are we going to fill a gap that nobody else is going to be in the same position to fill? But then also communicating with peer organizations that operate in similar spaces and thinking, okay, if you're here and we're there and this other group's there, then like what's left that's not covered, and how do we figure out a plan to have that covered if possible? Or are we making a decision to say this is going to be relentless and that piece is going to have to wait? And are we okay with that when we work out this plan? So I think that's sort of a special component of the preparation that is going on this time. And then I think another piece that a lot of us are thinking about that is perhaps not as deeply institutionalized at this point as that kind of peer organization like IRAP and other immigrants' rights organizations, and I'm sure the National Women's Law Center and other gender justice organizations and other reproductive health justice organizations are doing. But there are also common threads across our different groups. And I think we're all tending to convene in the issue-specific spaces, which is totally natural. But if you think about things that are different this time around, if we are looking at a second Trump administration, the case law is different this time around. And some of the case law about, the scope of administrative law, and also some of the case law about standing and other things, like they're going to affect actually all of us in pretty similar ways. So I think that's another piece, among the many for us to add to sort of our thinking and our preparations as we get closer, if that's where we're going.
So as, just sort of picking up, Laurie, on where you got us, which is thinking about this election, right, moving to 2024, what issues in each of your work are you most focused on or feel like could be most impacted by this year's election? And Laurie, maybe we could start with you.
Yeah, I mean, for us, it really is all of them. I think, an unfortunate reality, IRAP, our U.S. Legal Services Program, also has a program at the U.S.-Mexico border. And I think an unfortunate reality is that like the sides have moved really close together in a really terrible place for human rights at the U.S.-Mexico border. And so, there will be differences with different administrations and how that is approached. But I think like that's a place where the policies from the US government have been extremely negative, and we have no reason to believe that that is going to change over the near term. And I think that's a place where we would have to have a really serious conversation and success around narrative change if we're going to see any change in that political conversation, but that's not going to happen in the next 3 months. So I think that's one place where actually we might see, I hesitate to say less dramatic change, because I think that we could see very dramatic change, but I think that's a place where we'll see limited opportunities for really positive improvement, no matter what we're looking at. I think we have seen, increases in U.S. refugee admissions during the Biden administration, and we've seen some innovation in U.S. refugee admissions processing, the overseas processing of applicants for refugee status during the Biden administration. And I think that A lot of that work could really be expanded in the parts of the world where the really innovative stuff is happening. More people could be granted access to that innovative stuff and to better paths to resettlement than are currently available. And that innovative stuff could be employed in other parts of the world where it hasn't been tried out yet. So I think there are opportunities for real progress forward to support the human rights of people on the move and the resettlement possibilities of people on the move. But it will be really different. We could also be looking at another shutdown of the U.S. refugee admissions program altogether, which we have been through before.
And for us, I agree that it sort of impacts everything. It impacts all the work. Obviously, abortion and reproductive rights are at top of mind in this moment. And there's sort of more than two scenarios. It also depends on what Congress looks like. But certainly a real and plausible concern is efforts to enforce a national abortion ban, arguing that the Comstock law permits, without Congress taking any action, permits crackdown on any sort of transfer of not just medication for medication abortions, but any sort of materials used in abortions. And that is only one dramatic place where reproductive rights are really at stake. In an alternative world of a friendly administration and abortion rights support majorities in Congress, we could actually see codification of a national right to abortion and support for abortion access. So very stark differences based on where we find ourselves in the coming months. In addition, while abortion and reproductive rights is appropriately on top of mind, I think that there's also, of course, a huge difference in possible futures around LGBTQ rights and trans inclusion in particular. That is work that the Law Center has been deeply committed to, and where there are just really stark choices ahead in terms of where the federal government is going to be putting its legal and rhetorical power. And more broadly, in addition to the attacks on abortion and reproductive rights, the attacks on trans people and LGBTQI people more broadly, I think that those are sort of pieces of a multi-prong attack on our sort of core notions of protections against sex discrimination, our core notions of gender justice. Some of it goes under the heading of anti-DEI, efforts to basically make unlawful or illegitimate any sort of effort to affirmatively address gender justice in institutions. Some of it is attempts to assert that, for example, protections against harassment are somehow a First Amendment violation. And some of it goes under a religious freedom heading, an argument that religious rights, moral rights somehow trump any kind of right to be free from discrimination and harassment, any sort of right to access healthcare. So those are the places where I think we expect to see the most dramatic contrast depending on where the elections bring us.
So I'd love to hear more about, you've both referenced the need to strategically plan for any outcome. And there is a lot of, there's something very dynamic about that planning process, it sounds to me. So I'm wondering if you could share more about what you're anticipating with either a Republican or Democratic victory in the election, what you're most concerned about in either event. And Emily, maybe we can start with you.
I sort of started to touch on this in a second Trump administration. We're very concerned about an attempt to enforce an abortion ban, even without Congress taking action. We're also concerned about ongoing attempts to roll back things like the Affordable Care Act's protection for cost-free contraception coverage. there's a range of protections that currently exist under federal regulation and we think under federal statute, asserting that you can't discriminate against people because they have had abortions at work or at school, that you have to accommodate people who have pregnancy needs for accommodation, including abortion-related accommodations. So all of those efforts to sort of protect the ability of people to access abortion without retribution from the institutions that they're part of, those are definitely on the line. We also do a lot of work around judicial confirmations, not just on the Supreme Court. Certainly, the Supreme Court is very relevant, though, including in the next presidential term, but also the lower courts. Among other things, we are a litigating organization as well. So that work to try to ensure a fair judiciary committed to equal justice under the law is one that looks very different in some of the different scenarios. And I could continue listing things that concern me, but I will say, if it is a Harris administration, there are many ways in which we breathe much easier at the National Women's Law Center in terms of the policy work. But I do think that one of the things that we are spending time thinking about is, first, if it is a divided government and a Republican Congress or a divided Congress, that creates a lot of challenges. If it is a Republican Senate, I think it will be an incredible challenge just to confirm a cabinet, putting aside judicial confirmations. And I think that if we are in the position of having a first woman president and a first woman of color president, I think that will be a wonderful achievement for the country. And I think that we have seen enough of women in leadership moments like this to know that there is likely to be very quickly a chorus of voices saying she's failing, she's not good enough, and a very quick set of challenges around approval and around public support that any agenda will have to overcome. And then the last problem, which I hope I am so lucky to have, is I think that if we are in the position of a first woman president, that just as when Obama was elected president, there was both a narrative that we've overcome race and that we are post-racial, that we may see some level of that, and also some, hesitance for this administration to lean too far into gender issues because that is not necessarily the brand that they want in that moment. And so for an organization like mine, that is a potential thing that we will navigate as well.
And I think, we're watching some really specific issues. One of those sort of wider umbrella issues that we're watching that will, continue to be an issue, but with different color in either administration in 2025, is this question about the U.S.-Mexico border. But it's not just the line that people think of when they say the U.S.-Mexico border. U.S. policy has for years been engaged in a project of externalizing and expanding that border. And so we've now seen U.S. government policies that create this legal space of the border that extends both very far south of the physical border and crosses into many countries south of Mexico, and also extends very far north and extends into some border-related policies that are internal to the territory of the United States, but that treat people in a rights capacity as being still at the border. And we see that in old policies like expedited removal and a chance that a Trump administration would engage in really expanded efforts to use the power of this rapid, limited due process, expedited removal process that has some arguments available to use in different contexts internally than are currently employed. But we also see it in programs like there's a family expedited removal program going on now, where people are sort of processed at the border, but then complete some of the traditional kind of border processes, like these things called credible fear interviews, to even see if they're allowed to apply for asylum. They're completing those not at the border, but at certain cities and mostly cities within the United States. But then they're still part of this rapid fire process, and the whole thing is built with all the obstacles to obtaining legal counsel, for example, that actually exist at what we think of as the traditional border. But to talk some about like the different color we would see in these policies, in the Trump administration, we also saw the Remain in Mexico policy, which was, officially called the Migration Protection Protocols, but they weren't protecting anybody. And they were creating this limbo legal space where people were physically in Mexico, but they were being treated almost like they were in the United States for some purposes, and definitely like they were in Mexico for other purposes. And we expect to see a return to those kinds of limbo spaces, perhaps through a return very much to that exact program, but perhaps through other creations of spaces of legal limbo for people on the move. And we're very worried about what those are going to look like in terms of their human impact, and also sort of how equipped advocates are to respond to the needs of people on the move who find themselves in those kinds of limbo spaces. So that's sort of a very specific example of the kinds of concerns that we're sort of carrying with us as we go through these next several months.
So we've focused, I think, so far, and maybe intuitively, because it's a presidential election year, on the ways that presidential administration change can impact the work that you all are doing. But you've also both referenced, of course, the congressional races, the House, the third of the Senate that's up, and state and local elections that can influence both of your policy spaces. So I wonder if you could share what, if anything, you're thinking about in those other electoral spaces in terms of planning or looking ahead. And Laurie, let's start with you.
Sure. I mean, I think my answer is going to be less directly tied to your question a little bit than Emily's, because our work isn't so directly on the sort of electoral side. But when I think about the local side of the work and what's been really impactful coming from the political spaces on our client communities and frankly, like their rights and their chances in this world, has been this real shift in how we talk about immigration in the United States. And you now have mayors in New York and Washington, D.C. and Chicago and other places very far from the border who don't talk about immigrants anymore. They talk about migrants, and migrants aren't your neighbor anymore, right? Like it fundamentally changes the investment that people have. And there are contexts in which people use the word migrant and it means different things. And you'll hear me say people on the move. And that's a context in which people often use the word migrant specifically because they are still people on the move. But when you're talking about people who are in communities in the United States and making homes and going to work and having families, like, these are our immigrant neighbors, and they are our immigrant communities that many of us are part of. And it is just such a loss, I think, in terms of our possibilities for welcoming and building greater communities that include everyone when we focus on this sort of different concept of someone who is not our neighbor and who is arriving in a different way and who is perceived in a very different way. At the same time, there are really like celebratory stories. And I think we've, of course, seen the horrific rhetoric in recent weeks, months. I've lost track of time. It's all a vortex, right? But we've seen this totally horrific vortex rhetoric, but we've also seen sometimes very unexpected voices emerging actually to defend not only the people who are maligned in these horrible, racist, xenophobic diatribes, but also the communities that they're building and that we're all benefiting from. And so I think there is a really powerful narrative there. And I think we're also seeing that kind of powerful narrative emerge also in the world of refugee resettlement, where the US government now has a policy that's allowing people to privately sponsor refugees. So you have like groups of 5 people in American communities who've brought a refugee family in some very real way to build and become part of their community. And there is real magic in those kinds of stories, and those are local stories. So I think that's a place where our work does touch upon the local, but in terms of the policies, like the immigration world is just such a world of federal policy, again, particularly in the sense that IRAP really assists people outside the United States trying to enter for the most part.
And also, I'm thinking about Congress and where we can find ourselves post-congressional elections, thinking about lots of things. But one of the things that's going to happen in Congress next year, no matter what happens in the election, is a tax bill will be passed because the tax cuts that were passed under Donald Trump are expiring next year. And there is bipartisan agreement that they don't just expire and disappear, that there has to be something that takes their place. So we at the National Women's Law Center recognize that tax policy is social policy. And so there are a lot of reasons that we care about that tax fight. One of the reasons is because we care so much about systemic reforms to our childcare system and to our care systems more broadly, family and medical leave, home care for the elderly and people with disabilities. In order to create the sort of systemic reforms that we need in our care economy and in our care infrastructure, that requires government revenue. It requires public investment because these are public goods. And so the conversation about taxes is also a conversation about care because it's about whether we'll have the revenue to invest in those solutions. There's also specific fights to be had that we will have with whatever context we are in around the child tax credit and the support through the child tax credit for families and how robust that will be, whether that can grow, whether that can look more like the support that families had in the height of the pandemic. So that is some of the planning that we are doing, trying to be ready for all of the different flavors of what that tax conversation can look like, because we know it is happening, that is one of the things that no matter what will move in Congress, just in different contexts. We also, somewhat relatedly, if we find ourselves in a situation where there is a Republican House or House of Congress and a Democratic president, we have a debt ceiling crisis that will be created in that moment early in 2025. And that is a moment where it will be really important to ensure that a conversation about the debt ceiling is connected up to the conversation around tax cuts. So folks who are posturing as very concerned about the debt don't get to 6 months later demand huge tax cuts for billionaires. And so that work, the strategizing around how to navigate the debt ceiling fight that would come very early in a Harris administration, that's not likely to be an issue if Donald Trump is president, because a Republican Congress won't force the issue in the same way. But that fight that would come very early in a Harris administration could really set the terms for a great deal of the policy that comes after by if it is the moment for some agreement to cut spending drastically in the years ahead. So that's one of the things we're thinking about when it comes to Congress. We're also thinking about, in a world where there is a Democratic trifecta, how to ensure that moment, if we are in that moment, it is very much because voters turned out because they cared about abortion, because women voters turned out because they cared about abortion, how to ensure that translates into actual legal protections. And so that is planning and strategy that is happening now. On the state level, sort of no matter what happens, there will be affirmative work we're doing in some states and defensive work we're doing in some states, and some states will do both. We've named about 6 priority states, sort of across the ideological spectrum, red to purple to blue, where we're going to be concentrating that work, both for its own sake, because state policy has a huge impact on people's lives, and because the states are sort of the places where the fight often happens first, either for good or for ill, and then gets translated into federal policy. So, in recent years, for example, we've had great success at the state level around a range of equal pay policies, like prohibiting employers from setting pay based on your salary history, which allows pay discrimination to follow people from job to job to job. We've had big victories requiring employers to put salary information in job announcements, which helps level the playing field around negotiations and just sort of helps shine a light on pay practices. So that's an example of places where good affirmative stuff can happen in the states that then provides a model in the medium to longer term for federal work. On the other side, the really vicious attacks against trans students, against public education more broadly is something that we sort of first saw in state and local fights, which has bubbled up to be more of a national threat in conversations. So we will be doing both the affirmative and the defensive work at the state level, no matter what happens.
Thank you both. So I'd like to sort of shift forward to thinking together about how the public interest community can prepare and, whatever the future holds in January 2025, engage and sort of mobilize to meet that moment. So I guess first, what do you anticipate the greatest needs will be for you, and then that pro bono volunteers or lawyers could pitch in on? Emily, maybe we could start with you.
Yeah, of course it will look a little different depending on what world we're in. In a hostile administration, definitely in 2017, one of the things that the Law Center did was really purposefully sort of lean into our role as a litigating organization. And we continue to do a variety of sorts of litigation now, but definitely thinking about fights to challenge unlawful regulations, unlawful executive actions. That would be a place where, whenever we litigate, we do it with a pro bono partner. We need and depend on and value that partnership. And so that would be a place where sort of there's a range of legal fights that we would expect to begin in the courts, where we would love to and need to partner with pro bono firms in order to be effective. We also, basically, no matter how the election goes, a lot of our work is regulatory work. And while it looks different depending on the context, doing the legal analysis about the basis, the regulatory authority, the basis for the reg, which is all the more important now in a friendly administration, given Loper Bright and the new obstacles to rulemaking. That work of making sure that we are putting forward the strongest legal arguments possible in support or in opposition to proposed regulations, really thinking about what is possible for an agency to do and undertake. That is work where having pro bono partners to help us figure out those sort of knotty legal questions, really, really important. A thing that actually maybe doesn't look that different in either scenario, which is a place where we continue to really look for pro bono support. One of the things the Law Center does is operate the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund and the Legal Network for Gender Equity. And through those projects, one of the things we do is connect up people who have experienced harassment or discrimination at work or at school or in trying to obtain healthcare with attorneys who at the very least agree to do an initial legal consultation, may take on the matter. Sometimes attorneys do that pro bono, sometimes they don't, but continuing to sort of have a bench of attorneys who are willing and able to engage on a pro bono basis with those clients who come to us through Time's Up Legal Defense Fund and through the Legal Network for Gender Equity is a place where we continue to look for pro bono partnership. We also operate an abortion access legal defense fund, providing legal support to people who find themselves under some sort of legal attack as a result of helping folks get abortions. And there too, having pro bono partners who can help figure out the knotty questions, who can take on representation, who can be part of that effort. That will be important work no matter what, since the abortion fight, sadly, is not a fight that goes away, no matter how wonderfully the elections go.
And I think we have very similar buckets of need. We are also a litigating organization, and we need pro bono partners for that litigation. And we need pro bono partners not only for ourselves, but also for other groups, including for many groups that really don't have the kind of litigation capacity that IRAP and the National Women's Law Center have, and really having that ability to have pro bono partners to help advise those folks when there is an opportunity for sort of notice and comment rulemaking. Those folks can have really important voices, I think even still in this new context, in providing written comments, but they might not have the experience in doing so, and the litigation lens to put on to like, what do they need to get into the record? What can they get into the record that nobody else can speak to as part of the notice and comment process that could ultimately lead to the challenge that brings down a rule? So I think that's really a place where pro bono assistance can be very impactful. And then certainly we also, regardless of the administration, I tell you tomorrow, I have people who need a lawyer in the immigration context, and IRAP places our cases with both in-house representation through our staff, but also through pro bonos that we mentor through that process. And I think I really want to celebrate the many pro bonos that I've worked with over the years in immigration spaces who come to the work with, I think, the best thing any of us can bring to our legal work as public interest attorneys, which is the question of like, I know how to do some stuff, right? Like, I know how to interpret legal questions. I know how to fill out forms. I know how to gather evidence. How can I be useful? Instead of coming in from a space of like, this is the thing in the news, I want to represent a client in that situation, or I want to represent exactly this type of person, or I'm looking for exactly that. This sort of like, I know how to do some legal stuff. How can I put that to use to help somebody right now is such a really special type of pro bono partnership and pro bono attorney dedication to our clients and our clients' needs. And so I really look forward to seeing that play out again. And also, we sort of need that because some of the pro bono opportunities that come when other traditional pro bono spaces shut down. So like if asylum is harder to access, if the US refugee admissions program is shut down in meaningful ways, at least, then sometimes the only path available is something like a family reunification path, which doesn't always have the same sort of pro bono appeal. Sometimes it does, and it does if you're coming from a place of like, I know how to do a thing, how can I help? But it's not always what people think of when they think of pro bono opportunities. And so in a world of constrained pathways, family reunification can be really powerful, just sort of like, in some ways, sort of basic work, but without a lawyer, it can become really problematic and troublesome, and a person cannot access safety who otherwise could have. And even in a world where the other pathways aren't shut down, as slow and as painful as the family reunification immigration pathways can be, sometimes they really are a person's best way out of a refugee camp. And so just sort of keeping an open mind about what types of pro bono engagement sort of are appealing or count or serve the broader purpose or instinct that one might have to sort of respond to what's going on in the news is something that I think is really special that we see play out time and again, but that really is sort of the best the profession has to offer.
And I thought of one more thing, maybe two more things that I should say about pro bono opportunities. One, as a former general counsel for the Law Center, I'm embarrassed I didn't remember that one of the things that the Law Center really depends on in terms of pro bono support is pro bono help for us as an organization in thinking through, our own legal issues from a range of perspectives, from, leases to contracts to employee relations issues. So that is a place where pro bono help has been incredibly important. And I will say that if we find ourselves in a Trump administration, one of the things that I really anticipate are a range of governmental attacks on civil society. And so pro bono support to help the organizations who may be facing a variety of, subpoenas and investigations, or I hate to think, I think could be an incredibly important way for attorneys to show up in that moment. And the other thing that I will say, I think it's important to to underline that no matter how the elections go, there's going to be a lot of work to do and a lot of need for lots of reasons. One reason being that no matter how the elections go at the federal level, there will continue to be a cadre of state attorneys general who are working hard to take down any positive action at the federal level. And so having pro bono support around amicus briefs or intervention efforts or other engagement around that host of legal fights, which will only be sort of more motivated if we see a Black woman as president leading these efforts. That's another place where we would love to partner with pro bono folks going forward.
But also, we don't have to wait until January. And so I'm sure that there are parallel things in your sort of universe of work, Emily. But in my universe of work, I can say to the private law firm pro bono attorneys, especially on the call, if you're sitting on an immigration case and you haven't filed it yet, which I totally get it, it happens, file the case. I think like that is a thing that we can do that is actually part of preparing for a potential change in administration. Getting those applications in, it can make a difference to the level of protection that a person has against negative enforcement actions. It can make a difference to the kinds of claims a person might have if they're already in the pipeline for a program that is trying, that another administration is trying to shut down. It doesn't always do those things, but it can do those things. And it certainly doesn't protect anybody or give anybody a claim to anything if it's not filed. So I think one push I would make is that like, there's still stuff we can do. There's still time left. January 20th is not tomorrow. And, it may or may not bring like a hugely dramatic change. It will bring some change, of course, but just really a push to think about sort of what is within all of our collective control to do now that will protect our clients and our client communities and the missions of our organizations and the shared values that we have.
And that, I'm really glad that you raised that, Laurie, because one of the things I wanted to talk about next was what we can do now. And, kind of it picks up, I think, on a feeling you described earlier, which is some anxiety looking ahead to a change in administration. I think many public interest-minded lawyers are sort of wondering where they can channel that right now. So you've given us one example. I wonder, I don't want to put you on the spot to give another, if you have other ideas. Or if not, maybe Emily, if you have some.
I think,
Go ahead, Laurie.
just another one to put out there that has parallels in other spaces as well beyond immigration, but in the immigration space, often a person is eligible for like a couple of different things, and there's one thing that's clearly better than the other things. And so I think, pre the first Trump administration, a lot of times there was a lot of good reason to focus on the best option in many cases, not all. And then during the Trump administration, a lot of immigration attorneys adopted sort of a kitchen sink approach because it was the way to protect somebody, even though that introduces additional trauma for our clients and expense sometimes for clients. I mean, it can have downsides for clients too. And so it's a conversation to have obviously with your clients. But I think considering sort of, I was worried this was going to be too depressing. So I thought of a rhyme, which was sort of like file your cases, cover your bases in terms of like thinking about the kitchen sink again, and then prepare to be tenacious. Like these things can drag on for a long time, not just in immigration, but in other spaces too. And sort of like having a longevity plan, if something is staffed by a pro bono team, oops, my lights went out, staffed by a pro bono team at a law firm, like there's likely to be transition. How are you going to handle that transition? What's the plan in place? How is that not going to harm your clients and your case? Sort of just in case we needed something a little bit lighthearted. That's what I came up with. That's all I've got for lightheartedness. I'm going to turn my lights back on.
No, I love that. And everyone probably also saw my cat join the panel earlier too. So we're all doing the Zoom thing. Emily, I wonder if you have any ideas on things folks can do now or do now to prepare.
Well, don't come to the National Women's Law Center for this because we don't do it, but doing election protection as attorneys is a good thing to do in the coming weeks. But I will say, I think that this is a moment to think about where do you want to be building the relationships with organizations, with public interest attorneys who are doing the work, because I keep saying, well, the shape of it will look different. The work on those issues will be necessary and urgent no matter how the election shakes out. And so if folks are feeling motivated around reproductive rights, for example, this is a good moment to reach out to the National Women's Law Center or Planned Parenthood or, the range of reproductive rights organizations to say, how can we strategize together so we can make us part of your scenario plan? We can be the resources who are ready to go when we are moving forward, either like writing the memo about how this is the regulatory action you can take, or filing the case about how this is a violation of whatever core protections. So I think that is a thing to do now, is to do a little landscaping of where do you want to show up, because no matter what the particular scenario we find ourselves in is, there will be work to do on that issue. It just will be a slightly different stance that you're taking.
So one last thing I wanted to ask you both on, not just in presidential election years, really all the time, I think public interest lawyers who are working, striving for justice, are therefore constantly seeing injustice. And I think that, we think a lot about building resilience toward that. Knowing that in moments like this, there can be heightened anxiety looking ahead or thinking about the many needs for public interest lawyering and pro bono opportunities looking forward. I just wonder if you have any thoughts to share on how to build resilience as public interest lawyers, particularly in the aftermath of sort of seismic change elections.
I mean, it's
And
definitely
Emily, let me start with you.
Yeah, it's definitely a conversation we're having internally at the National Women's Law Center, is about how do we create a workplace culture that supports people even in times that are traumatic and scary. Again, no matter what happens, I think you can call these times traumatic and scary. And enable a sense of community that helps support people in the work, as well as creating some space for people to stand back when they need to. So we've talked about things like figuring out who's on call on particular weeks or weekends, especially since in a hostile administration we don't have control over anything. The Friday night at 5 emergency that is being dropped at that moment on purpose to make it harder to respond is a real thing. And so doing a little planning ahead of time about who on which team is going to be ready to go when, rather than everybody being asked to go 110% all the time, is one thing. Another thing that we've talked about is spending some time identifying what a win is. Sometimes a win is slowing down the bad thing. Slowing down the bad thing means that fewer people are harmed by the bad thing. And it means that the bad actor has to use more energy to make that bad thing happen, which prevents them from doing some other things potentially. And so being specific and naming for folks that even when something feels like a loss, because the bad thing has still happened, that there were wins that made it better. I think that's important. It's also been important with our staff to, do a little storytelling. A lot of folks are early career and were, in college when Donald Trump was elected in 2016. So doing a little storytelling about how there were times that we won, or at least made the bad thing not as bad. There were things that we successfully pushed back against. Andy Puzder did not become the Secretary of Labor. He was very bad. He was worse than Acosta, who did become Secretary of Labor. So giving some sense of how victories are possible, even in challenging situations, and the ways in which those victories have happened, I think is also helpful for people to recognize that there is still meaningful work to do, and that doing that work can continue to have an impact. I think finding the ways to identify that for each other and for the broader community, because it's not just about our staff getting demotivated, it's about sort of the broader citizenry, the broader movement feeling hopeless and unable to move forward, being able to name the ways in which progress can happen and victories can happen, I think is really important.
Hard to have much to add to all of that. I think we're thinking very similar things too. Another component of it, I think, also is sort of for folks who, like me and Emily, are at kind of like the public interest organizations, as opposed to like the plugging in on a more project-based sort of model from the private law firms as pro bonos, is thinking about also like talking about what we did last time and also like what went wrong. So like the having a person on call is because last time around we were all on call all the time, and like we're still tired from it, right? And so I think just for us being explicit about what's coming from the things we wish we'd done differently last time and the costs that we ultimately had to bear based on the way we did it last time, and how can we serve our client needs and our mission without doing it quite that way again, has been helpful. Being very explicit about those lessons learned and having a specific policy in place for how we're going to do it next time there's an emergency, whatever administration the emergency is in. So that has been one piece of it. And then I think a second piece of it, we talk a lot about how hard this work is, and we should. It is extremely hard work to do, work advancing our rights that are at risk, and others' rights that are at risk, or that have been already trampled. But it's also really joyful work. And just like the people that we work with, whether it's community-based and grassroots organizations or individual clients and families, just like they can be discouraged on some days, like they show up, they're getting there, they're putting one foot in front of another, they're sharing that resilience. And I think by seeing our clients and our client communities not as victims, but as human beings who are engaged in this day-to-day battle, it highlights their resilience. And so we get both the sort of frequently talked about vicarious trauma, but also sometimes the under-recognized vicarious resilience that comes from the communities and the clients that we serve, and the joy that we get to experience from working alongside them. And so I think being really tuned into the fact that there are two sides to that coin can really help with that side of the work as well.
Thank you both so much. That's really a lovely place to sort of wrap up that part of the conversation. We have some time left if attendees have questions that they want to pose to our panelists. You can click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and feel free to add in a question while we have the benefit of their expertise. Just gonna see if we have any.
We do not currently, I just checked.
Yeah, and seeing none. Okay. Well, I just want to thank both you, Emily, and you, Laurie, for joining us to have this conversation. It was really engaging. It is so important to think ahead about what is to come and what that looks like for your organizations from a strategic planning level, but also for the public interest lawyers who are thinking about what they can do to pitch in whatever happens next. So thank you both for sharing your insights here.